stop my or start the video feed when I slice it later. But good morning. Good
Morning.
to see everyone here, catching up on the events of the day here. We've got quite a bit to tackle today, but first, want to see if there are any questions or comments or brilliant ideas or anything else about the section we got. Yeah, Bob.
Just underline it because I know you'll talk about it because the book talks about it a bunch. The whole stuff with prophets and men of God and seers, that's all just, it's odd. It's not like what we see in prophets later in the Bible.
Yep.
And it's odd. Some of the stories just like, why are they there?
Yeah.
Like the seer in chapter 13, 113. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. All right. Yeah, actually, Bob, I'm going to tackle that more next week because we're going to be dealing with Amos and Hosea next week. But yeah, we'll mention that a little bit here. John.
Yeah, Jim, are you going to cover how it is the North and the South kingdoms came to be separated, and were they enemies? And occasionally they were, and occasionally they weren't. Are you going to cover that?
We'll deal with some of that. Yes, most definitely. Yeah, that's a important piece of this section here, and the next several sections. Divided monarchy.
I have a test. Name all the kings.
Yeah, right. Good luck on that.
Oh my gosh.
I can do the 12 tribes of Israel, but there are too many kings, and their names are similar, a lot of them. So
Yeah, and some of them were quite short-lived.
yes.
7 days.
Yeah, especially up north. Well, any others? Well, I'm gonna hit share screen here, and we'll dive on in. Okay, let's get I get to see a green box. You all don't see that, but you just see stuff moving around. Okay, there we go. All right, so here we are this week. As we said, we've got the section called Divided Monarchies. We've got a civil war. Basically, it happens. It's not really a war, but there's a definite split between North and South. Reminder, we're still very much in the Deuteronomic history and will be for a while longer, though we've got some other things that are being pulled in by the Deuteronomistic historians. And we're in the books of Kings, and reminder again, we've said that before, in the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings are really one long book. So any distinction we make is artificial and later on. Okay, we've got a bunch of issues happening in this particular section. First of all, we got that split between North and South. Israel, the kingdom of the North, and the South, Judah, after Solomon's death. And it's in some ways it's kind of like our American story, the Civil War. The North actually has a little more wealth and power, but the difference is they get wiped out by foreigners first. And the South kind of carries on, and the South eventually writes the story. So there'll be a heavy, we'll talk about this more later, but the South is going to play a lot bigger part in the end. So it has some similarities to our American North-South divide in the Civil War, but then there's some real differences too. As we mentioned, we got a slew of kings, North and South. But then everything kind of slows to a crawl and focuses on the wicked King Ahab, the worst of the kings, either side of the line. And it also slows to a crawl to talk about the prophets Elijah and Elisha. Now, I used to say Elijah and Elisha, but because that's so similar, I've tried to break myself of that. So I try to say Elijah and Elisha. Neither one is correct. I mean, they're both correct in English. Neither one is what the Hebrews said. They say Elijah and Elisha. But anyway, Elijah and Elisha, I try to do that, though you may catch me slipping, going back to my old pattern. So we got that going on. And then we got this problem with rising and continuing idolatry, and that tripping up the people of Israel and Judah. And layered on top of all that, we've got the beginnings of monotheism. Now you go, wait, aren't the Jews monotheistic? The Jews will be monotheistic. They'll be the first great monotheistic religion in the history of the world, but they're not monotheistic at this point in history. That's something they grow into. rising monotheism, or scholars often talk about emerging monotheism. That's something that actually really won't hit strongly until the 500s BC. And then once they lock in pretty hard. And the Jews become, really about the time that the Jews become the Jews, and not just the Judeans and the Israelites and the Hebrews, but really Judaism is born about the time that monotheism locks in for this group of people. So we'll talk about what monolatry is in a second, if you're wondering. So hang on there. In fact, looks like on my slides, we're going to talk about that first. So idolatry, let's spend a little moment on that, a little excursus on idolatry here. So we've already seen some issues. We saw some issues in the book of Judges with worship going on of other gods besides Yahweh, the God of Israel. But it really kind of comes to the fore during Solomon's time. You may remember we talked about last week, Solomon was said to be worshiping in the high places, which is where the Canaanite gods were worshipped, not where you worship the God of Israel. In addition to also worshiping Yahweh and eventually building Yahweh a magnificent temple. We talked about Solomon being the most difficult of the kings because he starts so well and ends up so badly as far as being faithful to God and falling away. But there are some intimations early on. He does worship early on in the high places. And the way the Deuteronomistic historian phrases it or packages it, from their standpoint, from the standpoint of that school of Deuteronomy, what really trips Solomon up is the 1,000 women in his life and the fact that a lot of them are foreign princesses and they import their gods with them. And he tries to keep all the wives and concubines happy and builds a number of shrines to all the neighboring gods and deities. And so we've not only got the great temple to the God of Israel, Yahweh, we've got all these other lesser temples that Solomon has built to everybody and their dog, every little god from all the surrounding areas. All of these wives bring in their gods. And Solomon not only builds them temples, but he also worships with the women from time to time. So that, as far as the Deuteronomistic historian is concerned, is one of the hugest no-nos possible, and makes Solomon one of the worst kings. Not the very worst king, but one of the worst kings in the end, after starting out as being one of the great kings. So this is going to be a continuing issue, because I wanted to spend just a minute on what we're really talking about here. What we're really talking about, a lot of it with the Canaanites, and the Edomites and all these folks surrounding the Ammonites. One of the chief gods of the area was the god Baal or Baal. And Baal worship was ubiquitous, and it was there when the Israelites came in and conquered the land, took over the land, and they're fighting against it all the time for centuries and centuries. Baal was a storm god. Baal was a lightning god. Baal caused thunder. I assume with his hand raised and all these little statues that is probably a lightning bolt or something, a spear or a lightning bolt, maybe like Zeus. But he was definitely a thunder god, a storm god. And to be fair, a little bit in the Christian Hebrew Bible portrays Yahweh in that way too, talking about in the Psalms, Yahweh poetically riding on the clouds, and the lightning is at his command. Well, they're pushing back a little bit against Baal, but they're also maybe conflating Yahweh and Baal a little bit by doing that. So Baal is a classic storm god. Baal also has a female consort. There are actually a couple different consorts, depending on what region you're in, what era it is. But the two female goddesses that seem eventually to kind of conflate together are Asherah or Astarte, or Astarte. These are definitely fertility goddess figures. They are the consorts or the wives or the wife of Baal. And oftentimes they are worshipped as best we can tell. And this is, we're trying to piece things together after 3,000 years, and we dig up these little statues and things. But there's talk in the Bible about great Asherah poles, these poles set up, and there's a lot of discussion in the literature. There was a time when folks were saying, well, these are phallic symbols. Well, maybe not. Maybe they're more like trees. They're often set up in groves of trees. There probably was some kind of sexual worship that took place to imitate the fertility, to tap into the fertility that Astarte or Asherah would bring. But they're probably not phallic symbols. It may have been a mistake based on the shape of these goddesses, that they may be a little phallic in shape if they got eroded. So that was something you may still hear that out there, but that's pretty old and pretty discarded. Probably more fertility as far as trees, or maybe even these were set up as giant statues to Asherah. We're not exactly sure what these Asherah shrines are that the Bible keeps railing against, but somehow outdoors in high places, maybe associated with groves of trees, we have these shrines going on. What also makes it complicated is if you type Asherah or Astarte or into the Google, you will get all kinds of neo-paganism, new people worshiping these goddesses, and you can buy artwork that's done in the 21st century of folks that want to worship these fertility goddesses still. Not that they've been worshiping them continually, but they've kind of had a resurgence. So it's a little difficult to piece together exactly what happened 3,000 years ago, but this is kind of the general pattern. And just so you know how much of a problem it is, famous discovery in 1968, they found this funeral inscription to a guy named Uriyahu. Here's Uriyahu's funeral tombstone, basically. And it says, "Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh and his Asherah." As far as this person is concerned, Yahweh, like Baal, has Asherah as a wife. God has a wife. That was a huge headline in 1968 in archaeological journals. And so obviously some blending, some syncretism is going on here. Now the Deuteronomistic historian would say, oh, this is way out of bounds. But as far as popular religion goes, apparently at least one person thought that the God Yahweh was equivalent enough to Baal to have Asherah as a consort or a wife figure. So a lot of blending, a lot of syncretism probably went on. So we've got this problem of syncretism, mixing up of different faiths. And we've also got the Hebrew people doing something that actually is a natural human tendency. They'll become fanatic monotheists later, but think about it for a second. Your God is the God that brought you out of Israel. Okay, brought your ancestors out of Egypt. He was a God of the desert. He was a God that was good for defeating Egyptians. But now you're in a new land. Now you're not a shepherd anymore. Now you're not living in the desert. You're trying to put down roots. You're trying to build cities. You're trying to farm. And your neighbors have these gods that control rain, and these gods control fertility and crops and things like that. So, if you're a new farmer, well, maybe I need to just hedge my bets a little bit. I'll still worship my God, but maybe I'll throw a little bit of worship towards these other gods as well. And really, we diversify our portfolios financially. It's the same kind of thing, perhaps spiritually. Maybe we need to take out some spiritual insurance by throwing a little worship in towards these other gods. And to be fair, most other systems had pantheons of gods. And so, having Yahweh and other gods was not abnormal. It was abnormal for the Jewish people later on. And they really became strict monotheists. But in the world they were living in, there's some real push and pull and tug on this. So this is going to be a continuing issue. Any thoughts or questions about that real quick before we dive on to what monotheism and idolatry are? Becky, were you on to ask? You're muted if you are.
Yeah, Jim, in terms of syncretism, I can't help but think of our Native American people who have not other gods, but other nature things that are very important to them, but yet can still worship God with a capital G. And is there a point where syncretism is really wrong, or how far can you go?
How far can you go? I mean,
and still be.
You go south of the border, and there are some Christian saints whose veneration looks a lot like Aztec worship in the old days. Jimmy was in Guatemala a couple of years ago. On the steps of the church was built over a Mayan holy site. and they still do a grain offering. They burn grain offerings at the bottom step of the church. The Catholic Church lets them at least do that.
Yeah.
So are they worshiping Mayan gods? Are they worshiping the Christian God by doing these old Mayan ceremonies? So there's, it's a big question. And to be fair, we celebrate Christmas with fir trees. Well, that's not Christian. That's not the Bible. We put evergreens up because of pagan religious things. We burn a Yule log because of pagan religious things. So we have some syncretism too. We're using it to worship Jesus. We're not using it to worship Odin or some Norse tree god spirit or something. But we do import those things. Jimmy, were you trying to get in? I heard you, I thought.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that not only on the outside of the church, but on the inside, there were candles in these things in the middle of the aisle where basically the processions would take place. And I thought that was kind of odd. That was a Mayan practice too. And so it wasn't just outside the church that happened, but inside the church too, that they were still practicing Mayan rituals. But and there was something else that I was gonna say too, but I can't remember now. But.
Okay. Well, if you think of it, you're not on my screen. John, go ahead.
Yeah, the syncretism still goes on. If you go to Sanctuario, they eat dirt, and the Catholic Church built their church on top of a site that the Indians used and thought the earth was holy there. And curative.
Yeah, and so in the Christian church, that's always been, do you baptize these pagan customs and bring them in? One of the reasons we celebrate All Saints Day when we do, the Orthodox celebrate a different date, but in the West, we're trying to compete with some October 31st stuff. And All Saints was brought in to kind of counter some of that. So do you baptize these customs and bring them into your big religious worldview, or do you say these are wrong and these are out of bounds? And that's a constant push and pull. Okay, well, let's keep going here. So let's talk about monotheism and monolatry. So what this is, and really early on, the Hebrew religion is very much religion of monolatry, not monotheism. Monolatry is this: I worship one God. I only worship one God. I'm exclusive to that God, but I don't deny the existence of other gods. I know that there are other gods out there, but my God is the best. My God's number one. Okay, that's monolatry. Monotheism is only one God. My God is the only God. There are no other gods, period. Full stop. Judaism will become a monotheistic religion. Christianity is monotheistic. Islam's monotheistic. One God. Monolatry, though, is what we're talking about here. My God's the best. My God's number one. My God's the one I'm loyal to. But I understand there are other gods out there, and my God may be in a contest with the other gods. If you read through Exodus, it's very much the God of the Hebrews is in a contest with the Egyptian gods about who has the true total power. And as we read through this part of Kings, we're still dealing with monolatry. So really, monolatry, even the way the Ten Commandments are phrased: I'm the Lord your God, brought you out of Egypt, out of the slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It's not denying the existence of other gods, but God is saying, I don't want them in your life. I don't want them literally in my face. Keep your other gods away. I'm the only one you need to be looking at. Sure, there are other gods in that system, but I'm the only one that you need to be looking at. Later on, Judaism will be very monotheistic. One of my favorite quick verses for that is from the Psalms. As for all the gods of the nations, they are but idols. It is Yahweh. It is the Lord who made the heavens. There's only one God out there. That's a monotheistic expression. That will be where the Jewish people get to, but it's not where they're at this point. So it's still a battle to see whether my God's better than your God. And there's also some territorial stuff. Well, my God is in charge of this territory. If I cross the border, maybe your God takes over once we, like cell phone towers, we cross over and the next cell phone tower picks up, the next God picks up over here. So that's going to be a continuing issue as well. Anything on this? All right. So I said last week, after Solomon, we're really going to start picking up more and more with historical and archaeological stuff hitting here. One of the problems will be is the historical stuff in the Bible is written from the perspective of the Deuteronomistic historians, and they've got an agenda to show that if you follow God, you're going to be rewarded. If you don't, you're not going to be. You're going to be punished. And, you know, like the Assyrian history, we'll talk more and more about Assyrian stuff as we go through the next few weeks. Assyrian stuff doesn't really care about the God of Israel. Assyrian stuff really doesn't care about Israel and Judah that much. They're pretty small players as far as the Assyrians are concerned. But they will have mentions of Israel and Judah, but they've got their own agenda. And, you know, like there's their agenda. That's King Jehu from the book of 2 Kings there. And he is right down on the ground making obeisance to the king of Assyria. That's an Assyrian. So we've very clearly got a historical king of Israel here, but the king of Israel is on his knees, face down in front of the king of Assyria. So as far as the Assyrians are concerned, the Bible is not so concerned about whether Jehu is on the ground in front of the king of Assyria or not. They've got other issues with Jehu. So that's part of the complication of lining up what the Bible wants to focus on and what other historical groups want to focus on. All right, well, let's talk about the text a little bit here. So we've got this aftermath of King Solomon. Solomon's son is Rehoboam. If you remember at the end of Solomon's reign, Jeroboam, confusing all these names, they're similar. Jeroboam kind of led a revolt up in the north, and Solomon quashed it, and Jeroboam went off to exile in Egypt to wait until Solomon died. Well, now Solomon's dead, and so he's going to come back into play. But the excuse, and Solomon also had some rebellion of some of the client states like Edom. Some of the other nations were rebelling, Moab, along the fringes of Solomon's empire. But Solomon's son Rehoboam gets off to a horrible start. He's got all these older, wise advisors who say, your dad was turning into too much of a tyrant and a despot. Ease up on the people. Don't be conscripting them to build big buildings anymore. Lower their taxes. You'll win favor with the people. But Rehoboam's young, and he also asks his young friends for advice, and they say, double down. If your dad was tough, you need to be even tougher. If you're going to be king, you need to be a real king. And unfortunately, Rehoboam listens to these young hotheads and not to his wiser, older advisors. And in fact, the advice he gets that's related in 1 Kings, you should say this to the people, Rehoboam. Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. That's what the people say. And you should reply, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I'll add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I'll discipline you with scorpions. And that's the advice Rehoboam takes. He quotes this advice almost verbatim to the people. So if the people are kind of a little bit iffy about the yoke of Solomon and trying to push back on that, to have new young prince become king and push even harder, something may give. And the something that may give is a split between north and south. And so Jeroboam comes back into play, and the northern tribes, who are already kind of iffy, go with him, and Judah continues on with kings from King David's line. So we have a real rift here. There is some war. There's battle that happens back and forth, but we've also got several centuries in play here. So there are times these folks have a common ancestry, common heritage, common religion. And so there are times where, they're more at peace with each other. There's, trade going back and forth. I mean, the prophet Amos came from the south and then ministered in the north. So there's some, definitely back and forth going on here as well. So it's not like they draw a line at the border and, it's heavily armed. They're sometimes at odds with each other, but oftentimes they're coexisting relatively peaceably. Now, just to show what's happening here, so at this time, I don't think we looked at this map, but we looked at a map similar to this. The red line is Solomon's empire, the extent of Solomon's empire. Within about 10 years after this north-south split, this is the southern nation, this is the northern nation. So all of these gains that Solomon and David had about this much of it. Solomon pushed it up here. But these huge gains of all this foreign territory especially is gone within about 10 years, between 930 and 920 BC, give or take. So by Israel having this internal strife at home, to deal with other nations, the unified monarchy, the glories of having this huge swath of land, those are over. They're down back to their old ancestral homelands, basically, or at least their homelands when they came in with Joshua and during the book of Judges. So Israel up in the north, Judah down in the south. Israel will center on ancient sites like Shechem, with where you had Jacob, a lot of Jacob stuff up there, and Judah will still kind of focus on Jerusalem as their capital. Samaria will be a rising capital city in Israel eventually. Basically, we have 10-ish tribes going north and 2-ish tribes going south. I think next week I laid it out a little more. Judah, sometimes you have Benjamin that joins in with Judah, and there may be a few Simeonites. Plus, you got some Levites that are spread over both areas. But basically, 10 tribes form the north and 2 tribes form the south, give or take. We'll talk more about that later when the Assyrians wipe them out. All right, so we've got these 2 separate countries here now. And they have separate kings, separate dynasties, separate lines. And for centuries, we've got these lines continuing until the northern kingdom's destroyed in 722 and the southern kingdom's destroyed in 586. Or 587. You see both those dates. So you got 19 kings in Israel during this basically 200-year period, and you've got 20 kings in Judah over 350 years, basically, give or take. So you've got more continuity down south. They stick with David's line down south, though they may kill off or dump one son and replace him with another son, but they stay within that royal family down south. There are several dynastic changes that happen up north, so much more volatile situation up north. So about the same number of kings, but almost, not quite, but almost half the time up north. So a lot more turnover up north. The other thing, and this is from Kings, written by the Deuteronomistic historian, remember, who's writing from a southern perspective and writing after the north is gone, punished by God, wiped off the map. As far as the scripture is concerned, all the kings in the north are universally bad. There's not a good one in the lot. Of David's line in the south, some are bad, but there are some exceptions to that are good. So I found that this chart's got a few flaws to it, but what helps, you've got the north over here and the south over here. You've got these periods of good kings, and they're in green, and bad kings are in red. And you've got just universal bad pinkish kings over here in the north. Manasseh depends on whether you're looking at First Kings or Second Kings or Chronicles. He's bad completely in Kings. He's bad then repents in Chronicles. So they've got him kind of as mixed here, bad then repents. But you've got some good ones mixed in with the bad up in the south. All bad up in the north as far as the scripture is concerned. And scripture, of course, is written by the folks down here, the folks in Jerusalem after this kingdom is wiped out. And part of their understanding theologically is, well, these kings didn't follow the God of Israel. That's why. That's why they're no longer here. Y'all, we need to get serious about following the God of Israel. And actually, they probably, we'll talk more about this later, but they probably really started writing this probably about the time of Josiah, 70, 80 years after the northern kingdom fell. So the Deuteronomistic historian is pulling on lots of things, but probably in this later time period here. So good and bad mixed in the south. Oh, golly. Okay, so all are bad up north, some are bad in the south. And again, we're writing from a perspective of Judah, the southern kingdom, plus Judah has the temple, and the Deuteronomistic historian sees that as part of what's going on too. They weren't faithful to worshiping Yahweh in the temple. They had these other things. They had shrines with golden calves. They worshiped more in the high places. We've been faithful. We've had the temple all this time. that Solomon built. And so God's favoring our side. So even though Israel's stronger, richer, maybe better militarily, 10 tribes versus 2 even, and their land is a little more fertile. The land in the south looks almost the same size, but it's got more desert involved. Nevertheless, the north gets wiped out first. The south continues on at the time these books are first collated in their final form. All right, so books of Kings. This section of First Kings, we've got kind of a repetitive formula that goes on here. It talks about the rise of the kings, maybe talks about a few deeds of the kings. There's a judgment. Is the king good or bad? Usually bad, always bad up north, usually bad in the south, but there are a few good ones. And then a death. And this pattern keeps going and going through all these, we've got 39 kings it goes through, and most of these kings follow this pattern more or less. And the pattern will often refer to these lost works that we have no idea what they are. They're not extant anymore, but when the Deuteronomistic history was written, apparently they thought that book was important, and you could just go look it up there. Go check the library. We know that these annals of these kings are there. So for example, one king, King Asa of Judah, or King Omri of Israel. So when Asa was in Judah, Omri began to reign in Israel. He reigned for 12 years, 6 of them in Tisra. He did some deeds, bought the hill of Shamer for a couple of things, fortified things, built Samaria, made Samaria the capital. But judgment, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil than all who were before him. He was the worst so far. And that's saying something, because he followed Jeroboam and followed the sins of Jeroboam and made God angry by following idols. All right, and the rest of the things he did and the power they showed, those are written down in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. You know that, so why am I saying any more? And he died and was buried, and his son Ahab succeeded him. So this is a very typical pattern, north and south. There are some kings that we find more data about, but this is a repetitive pattern as you go through first and second Kings. By the way, I was going to say this with this slide too. One of the problems here with dealing with all these kings, we got Jeroboam in the north, we got Rehoboam in the south, we got Ahab and Ahaziah, we've got an Ahaziah in the south, an Amaziah, we got an Ahaz. So there's similar names back and forth across these things, which makes it just confusing as anything. I wouldn't try to memorize all these kings of Israel and Judah. There are a few that stand out, but they're reference works for a reason. And this is one of those places where reference works are more helpful. All right, so we got some history of some of these kings. Now all of a sudden, it's like the book of Kings just grinds to a slow crawl. We've been ripping through all these centuries of history, king. And then all of a sudden we've got this huge focus on Elijah, his successor Elisha, and King Ahab, who's the king during Elijah's time. And the narrative slows to a crawl. The thought is what we've got here is, for various reasons, the Deuteronomistic historian is pulling in some other material. Okay, we've got all these chronicles of the kings that we're pulling in, some stuff from there, but let's bring in some stuff about Elijah and Elisha and King Ahab. And so this probably is stuff that's imported that they bring in. Why should we rewrite this? It's out there. Let's just cut and paste and stick some of this stuff in. Now, of course, we'll have to make some judgments and edit it. But it seems like they're drawing on a huge subset of material here. There are several reasons for seeing this as something imported. For one thing, Elijah appears almost out of nowhere. He's just, all of a sudden, he's there. And really, there are a couple of stories about him, but then he's told pretty quick, okay, Elijah, time to wrap up and pass on the torch. Well, didn't he just get here? Well, as far as scripture is concerned, yes, he did. Plus, we have a radical shift in tone here. Instead of racing through all these kings, we've slowed down to this crawl. It's kind of like the Gospels. You're going along lickety-split, and then you get to Holy Week, and time really slows down. We get a lot of detail about that last week. And in some Gospels, that last week of Jesus takes up as much space as his entire ministry. So same thing here. We've got things slowing down to a crawl, told in a different speed. Plus, the fact that Elijah's story kind of starts in the middle. There's no rise of Elijah, nothing narrating where he came from. It probably indicates that there's some other stuff that was out there that the Deuteronomistic historian didn't even bother to bring in because everybody knew it. So sadly, there's probably a lot more stuff about Elijah that was floating around in the 500s and 600s BC that's lost to us completely. Gone off the map. It would have been wonderful to have some more Elijah stories and know where Elijah came from. And apparently the Deuteronomistic historian was assuming everybody knew this. I don't need to tell you about Abe Lincoln growing up in a log cabin, and all of that, and being a country lawyer. Let's get him being president. That's almost the flavor here. And so all that stuff about early Elijah is lost to us completely. But tantalizingly, it seems to have been something that the Deuteronomistic historian knew about and said, well, I'm going to just start in the middle of the story here. So I would love to know what all the other stuff about Elijah was, but that's gone, lost to history. What we do have is this. Elijah kind of appears out of nowhere. It's in the midst of famine and drought. And Ahab is the king. And remember, Ahab worships the god Baal, and his wife Jezebel really is a Baal junkie, Baal devotee, huge Baal patroness. Baal's the rain god. Well, Elijah's appearing, it's drought. What good's a rain god in a drought? Hint, hint, hint. It's probably why the Deuteronomistic historian is starting at this point, pushing back on the Baal stuff. Elijah is told to go to Lebanon. So he starts in Israel, goes all the way off the map to another area. And he stays with a poor widow. And yet, while he's with her, miraculously, her food doesn't run out. Her son dies, and Elijah miraculously raises her. Now, this is a different tone. We got miracles here that there's not a lot of miracles that have been happening in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st Kings. There is some prophetic stuff. God speaks to people, but again, we've got a different tone here with this stuff being dropped in. So we've got miracle stories about Elijah and Elisha that really are not typical of the rest of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Plus, we've got this, God is providing. Who's the fertility god here? Who's the rain god? Well, God's providing for these people with Elijah's power while everybody else is suffering drought and famine. Hint, hint, maybe you shouldn't be worshiping Baal. And then there's this explicit, massive contest between 800 prophets of Baal and Elijah on Mount Carmel. Famous, wonderful scene. They build a couple different altars, and whoever can get their God to send down fire from heaven and consume the offering on the altar will be judged to be God. And 800 prophets of Baal go first. They cut themselves. They're praying to God, and yet they're not successful. In fact, Elijah sits there. It's a wonderful story. Don't have much time. He sits there taunting them. Well, maybe you need to talk louder. Your God may be asleep. Maybe you talk louder. Your God may be using the restroom. He just taunts them constantly. Nothing. And then he has the people pour water on Yahweh's altar and wood and offering, and drips over the sides of the altar, fills up a trench around the altar. Mark Twain actually said it was secretly gasoline, but that was another story. But anyway, pours water on the altar, and boom, fire from heaven. God sends down. Elijah has the prophets of Baal killed. Doesn't make Jezebel happy. These are her guys. So it's a little violent ending there. And then all of a sudden there's this gigantic rainstorm that comes. So God shows his power by sending down fire. God shows his power by sending torrential rain. Who's the storm god? It ain't Baal. Who's the rain god? Who's the fertility god? Who's the real god? It ain't Baal. So that's a huge part of this. Then we get this narrative. Ahab's wife is PO'd. She vows to kill Elijah and gets Ahab on her side. Elijah runs for his life and is depressed. He's just had this massive victory, and he runs off depressed. What a pouty guy. You should be riding high, and yet he runs away. He leaves Israel, goes all the way through Israel, all the way through Judah, out the southern end into pagan territory, sits down and says, God, kill me. God sends an angel to succor him and says, head to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. And Elijah does. So there's some recapitulation here of some of the Moses stories. Elijah is redoing some of the things Moses did, heading to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, to meet God. And he gets there. Wish we had time for all this. He goes to, in scripture, the cave, not a cave, the cave. which is probably Moses' cave where God hid him in the cleft of the rock when God appeared and let Moses see his backside outside of the cave. And there's wonderful narration. There's fire, earthquake, wind, but God's not in any of those. The text says over and over and over again. But there's a sound of sheer silence, or a sound of a still small voice, and God speaks to Elijah that way. Hint, I'm not going to do the flashy stuff anymore. From now on, prophets, you're going to have to be attentive to my spiritual voice, my still small voice. That's the way things are going to operate more from now on. The other stuff was great at one point in history, but now I'm speaking differently, is the subtext of God there. God also says, buck up, camper. There's 7,000 people in Israel who are still faithful followers of me. Well, it's not a lot, but it's a bunch. It's more than just you. And he says, go anoint Elisha as your successor. Elijah does that. Anoint 2 kings. Elijah won't end up doing that. Elisha will end up doing that. But one of these kings is foreign. God is not just interested in the people of Israel or Judah. He's also interested in Syria, Aram, other nations. God is not just the God of us. He's the God of more. So we got some emerging monotheism here at this point too. And Elisha will be the one that carries out those anointings, anointing Jehu and anointing Hazael. All right, then after this stuff, we actually focus in for several chapters on King Ahab. Very unlike the rest of the book of Kings, where we go quickly through these kings for the most part. Ahab in some ways is the worst king. And so we really, again, slow down to a crawl here, focusing on Ahab and how nasty a king he is. In fact, the judgment of First Kings, no one like Ahab, who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, urged on by his wife Jezebel. We still talk about Jezebels as a bad thing. She's a foreign queen, foreign princess, marries Ahab, and devotee of Baal. As far as the Deuteronomistic historian is concerned, they're the worst of the worst. We get a long story about Ahab lusting over the vineyard of his neighbor Naboth. Naboth won't sell it to him. Land is given to you by God to be passed down to your heirs. You don't sell that stuff. So Ahab arranges to kill Naboth. He takes over the land. Elijah comes and prophesies and says, God's going to take you out because of that. The dogs will lick up your blood. And Jezebel later on will be devoured by dogs as well. Those are the prophecies. And when we say dogs, remember for the Jewish people, Romans and Greeks had pet dogs. Jews never did. Dogs are unclean like pigs. They're not something you keep around. Dogs in their world are scavengers. Dogs do nasty things like vomit and then lick it up. Scripture says that. That's why they're unclean animals like pigs. I've got 3 beagles. We love our dogs, even when they do stupid stuff like vomit and lick it up. But remember, dog in the Old Testament and New Testament, dogs are bad animals. So these are wild, ranging, feral animals. That's where you're going. You're going to the dogs, literally. Then there's another prophet, Micaiah, that just drops in out of nowhere. Only chapter 22. This is not the prophet Micah. That's a later prophet that has a book in the Bible. We'll talk about him in a couple of weeks. But Micaiah, he also prophesies Ahab's death. And then Kings talks about Ahab dying. And he dies in battle, and they bring the chariot home, and they're washing it out, and the blood drips out with the water, and the dogs come and lick it up. So the prophecy is fulfilled. And Kings wants us to see that prophecy fulfilled. Okay, oh my, time was. Okay, so we got to transition to the prophet Elisha. Again, very little about Elijah. We'd like to hear a lot more, but we don't get that. We get this transition. He does a few more prophecies about Ahab and his success, about Ahab's successor. Then he and Elisha go and cross the Jordan, striking the Jordan with Elijah's mantle, and the waters part, just like they did for Moses and for Joshua. Hint, hint, recapitulation again. Elisha sees Elijah taken up in a whirlwind after also seeing God's chariots of fire. Elijah is not taken up in the chariot of fire, it's taken up in the whirlwind. But God's army, spiritual army, angelic army is visible to Elisha. He and Elijah have a vision of that. So God's got the real power. God's not only a rain god, God's also got this heavenly army. Hint, 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 follow God. So Elisha takes up Elijah's mantle, figuratively and literally. And because Elijah is one of the few characters that doesn't die in Scripture, he's taken up directly into heaven. There are all kinds of later legends about him coming back. And later on, there's a Jewish custom at Passover. You set the place for Elijah and hope just in case he shows up at your Passover, you got a spot for him. And it's because he didn't die the traditional way, just taken up to heaven directly. Okay, Elisha goes out. There are a number of Bob, did you have your hand up, or you're muted if you do.
Just as an aside, a little anecdote. Every Jewish family at Passover, you open the door for Elijah, and every family has the apocryphal story of drunk Uncle Leon that wanders in just at that moment.
You think it's Elijah? It turns out to be Uncle. That's funny. That's funny. Well, Elisha, also very different from the rest of the book of Kings. He also has a number of miracles. In fact, more miracles than Elijah. Purifying water, taking care of some boys that make fun of his bald head. Some she-bears come out and maul the boys. It's kind of a vicious story, but it's miraculous. Multiplies oil so a widow can pay some debts, raises a boy, feeds 100 people with 20 loaves. Later on in the Gospels, when Jesus feeds 5,000 with 5 loaves, this is a riff on Elisha. It takes 120 loaves to feed 100 people miraculously. With Elisha, Jesus can take a quarter of that bread and do 50 times more people. Okay. Great story of healing a Syrian general named Naaman. Again, God is not just the God of Israel, he's God of more, including Syria. He is able to heal General Naaman of his leprosy. And there's a story about floating a lost axe head that fell in the water. Lots of miracles that Elisha has. So again, not characteristic the rest of the books. So again, indicative that the final compilers have brought in this other wonderful material. And Elisha in some ways is greater than Elijah, as I said, a number of miracles. Okay, real quick, King Jehu. King Jehu succeeds Ahab and Ahab's son, Ahab's successors. He is anointed by Elisha. He fights idolatry. He wipes out Ahab's family. He eventually has Jezebel killed. And Jezebel, bless her heart, for all of the nasty stuff about her in the Bible, she goes out like a queen. She's a princess when she marries into Ahab's family, and she knows the end is coming, and she puts on her makeup, and she bravely goes out. And so there's a lot of bravado with Jezebel, even right to the end. But she is killed. She is eaten up by the dogs. Ahab fights this idolatry. So you think, oh, well, he's an Israelite king that's good. He's killing Ahab or fighting, not killing Ahab. Ahab's already gone. Getting rid of Jezebel, getting rid of Ahab's line, getting rid of the prophets of Baal. You're set up to think he's a good guy, but he's not really following God. He's doing this more for power politics. So as far as the historian's concerned, still bad. In fact, 2 Kings says he wiped out Baal, but he didn't turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam. Still left those golden calves in Bethel and Dan, the north and south. Bethel's in the south, Dan's up in the north. Fringes of the kingdom, these shrines that were set up long ago, century before. And you've done right with Ahab. And because of that, you'll get this. Your line will continue for 4 generations, but he's still not a good king. But he didn't follow the law of the Lord and did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam. So he gets the thumbs down, even though he's kind of mixed. He's probably the best of the Israelite kings. He has the highest of all the bad kings. He's the least bad. Is kind of the judgment of King Jehu. And again, he was the one in the Assyrian freeze from Nineveh, bowing to the king of Assyria. So then we get some other kings of Israel and Judah listed mostly by title. Again, we have that similar pattern over and over again. And the book kind of stops at this point. So we kind of, this chapter ends here. We've got more kings to deal with. We've got Israel getting wiped out in 722. We'll talk about that next week. Eventually, Judah will be destroyed. That will take us into the 500s. And that will take us, that's an important watershed moment. They get destroyed by the Babylonians, who follow the Assyrians. We'll talk about that later. And also next week, we'll focus in not only on the fall of Israel. They've got typo there in this chart. Another reason not to trust this chart, but there's good stuff though too. And prophets Amos and Hosea will minister in Israel during this time. We'll talk about them in the book next week. So, oh, such wonderful stuff here. Way too much stuff. But any thoughts or comments or questions here? Everybody's muted and silent. Huh? Oh, John's got to unmute here. Yeah, John.
Jim, can you give us a preview of the modern Jewish or the Jewish community to come? Who are they going to come from? The northern kingdom or the southern kingdom?
They are going to come from the south.
gonna-
Assyria, I'll talk about this later. Assyria has this policy of taking captive peoples and spreading them out throughout their empire and bringing in other people into your land. So they literally wipe 10 tribes off the map. The cohesion is gone. Whatever ethnic cohesion they had, Assyria spreads them out all over their empire. There were probably a few Jews left that mingled with these foreigners coming in and became the Samaritans. But Judaism will come from Judah. Judaism and the Jews will come from the southern kingdom. And there'll be some Babylonian stuff going on there too. But we talk about the lost tribes of Israel. That's the 10 northern tribes. They will be gone off the map of history. So it is the south that carries on. The north will be gone. Next week we'll get the north wiped out. Jimmy, do you have something?
Sure. I know in Samaria later they'll have a separate mountain to worship God on. Is that set up during the Israel or the Kingdom of Israel, or
Yeah,
it's kind of
Gerizim stuff is already there. In fact, there was some of that already in Joshua. Joshua and Judges, they had some stuff up there. So Mount Gerizim, there'll be a few. That's one of the reasons in Jesus' time the Samaritans looked down on, because there were a few Jews left that mingled with all these foreigners that the Assyrians brought in, and so they weren't real Jews anymore as far as the people from Judah are concerned. And so looked down upon, but they consider themselves Jews. They consider themselves better Jews than those that worship in Jerusalem. We worship on Mount Gerizim. Jesus talks about that with the woman at the well. So yeah. Thank the Assyrians for most of that. And there are still a few Samaritans. My uncle saw Samaritan. In fact, if you want to see the closest thing to Jewish temple worship, it's the Samaritans that knife goats and do sacrifices still. And so people study them. There are only about 1,000 of them, I think, last I saw. Very small remnant, but they still carry on some of these customs, thinking that they're doing what the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, wants them to do. All right, y'all. We'll stop there, and next week we'll pick up with the end of the Kingdom of Israel up in the north.
Thanks, Jim.
Sure thing. Y'all take care.
Thank you.